Wednesday, January 15th, 2020, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. This morning, I want to talk about JP Morgan, gold confiscation, and the ESF fund, or the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Before that, of course, let's quickly look at where the markets are. It's 8:15 London time. So we've got spot gold rebounding a little bit here. We're up $7 at 1553.20. Range has been 1545 to 1554. Silver is up 7 cents at 1785. Range has been 1775 to 1792. The Dow is down 30 points. The Dow futures 28,901. The S&P is down 2 points, and the NASDAQ 100 futures down 6. Yesterday, we saw the Dow rise while S&P and NASDAQ had small losses. The reason why, of course, the Dow rose was the JP Morgan results, which I'll come to in a minute. Currency-wise, foreign exchange-wise, we saw sterling rise a little bit yesterday, back above 130. Right now we're at 130.10, down about 10 pips. Euro is fairly steady, 111.20, and the dollar is back below 110 against the yen, 109.91. Dollar's a bit firmer here against the Chinese currency. It's at 6.89. Just a quick look at the Swiss franc. Yesterday, the U.S. Treasury threatened Switzerland with putting them on the currency manipulator list. So the Swiss franc rallied a little bit. They even said that Switzerland needed to spend more, increase fiscal spending. I think that's quite incredible that the United States now is trying to boss even Switzerland, other countries out there that are sovereign countries. Anyway, crude oil. WTI is down 0.5%, 57.97. Brent, likewise, down 0.5% at 63.82. I've noticed the bond markets have risen a little bit. Bond prices, yields have dropped. We've got the 10-year yield, U.S. Treasury yield, just below 180, down about 2 basis points. So, JP Morgan, gold confiscation, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, what have those got to do? Why are they related? Well, as a lot of you know, back in 1933, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, and the U.S. government confiscated gold from Americans. There were threats, not threats, but you could go to jail for not handing in your gold to your Federal Reserve, local Federal Reserve branch. That's what you had to do. So if you handed in a $20 double eagle, they'd give you a $20 note, Federal Reserve note. If you handed in a $10 eagle, they'd hand you a $10 note. So that was gold confiscation. Why did they do that? Well, because when Roosevelt came into power in March 1933, the banking system was kind of collapsing. He even had to institute the bank holiday, as I've said many times, for a week. And the way to stop people trying to get their gold and money out of the banks was to do gold confiscation. So that's the first step. Second step was, of course, the Gold Reserve Act, January 31st, 1934. And what that did, partly, one of the things they did was create the Exchange Stabilization Fund. So let's read through here what this fund does. It says the Exchange Stabilization Fund, or ESF, is an emergency reserve fund of the United States Treasury Department. I would say now that it's not an emergency. It's an everyday fund. It's like probably the biggest hedge fund in the world. Normally used for foreign exchange intervention. I would add as well other assets other than foreign exchange. And I would say gold is part of the foreign exchange market. If you look at all the bullion banks, they're also the biggest foreign exchange banks. If you look at the Reuters page, FX, which I've talked about many times before. I remember when I started working in the business back in the late 80s, looking at that page, all the FX pairs there, like dollar mark at the time, cable, and at the bottom of the page was XAU and XAG. And I even asked one of my senior colleagues, the guy who dealt for the small bank I worked for, what that was. And he said, well, that's gold. So gold is part of foreign exchange. It says this arrangement, as opposed to having the central bank intervene directly, allows the U.S. government to influence currency exchange rates without affecting domestic money supply. I would say it also, as I said before, allows them to influence stock prices and bond prices. As of October 2009, the fund held assets worth $105 billion, including $58.1 billion in SDRs from the IMF. Background: the U.S. Exchange Stabilization Fund was established at the Treasury Department by a provision in the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, January 31st, 1934. It was intended as a response to Britain's exchange equalization account. Yeah, the Bank of England still has that account as well. The fund began operations in April 1934, financed by $2 billion of the $2.8 billion paper profit the government realized from raising the price of gold to $35 an ounce from $20.67. Well, who was the big loser in this operation? Who paid for this profit? Well, it was the general public, who had to hand in their gold at $20.67 an ounce. They got left holding the bag. There's stories about, I think it was 1930 or 31, something about a business plot, big businesses to take over the United States government. And it was foiled, apparently, by Smedley Butler. But I tend to think this is kind of like a repeat of that, because with these profits, $2 billion in profit, you had the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, in charge of manipulating markets, of gaining even more power, and having, how can I say, the wherewithal to keep all this secret. And of course, the people who can deal with this fund are the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Treasury. And we know that JP Morgan is the banker for the U.S. Treasury, and that's where JP Morgan comes in. Yesterday we had results from JP Morgan. We've also had results from Citigroup. Wall Street Journal reports big banks post big profits thanks to strong U.S. economy. JP Morgan, Chase, and Citigroup reported big fourth quarter earnings, but Wells Fargo was hit by a legal charge. I would say maybe a little bit the economy has helped, but also the fact that JP Morgan and even Citigroup to some extent own the New York Fed. We know the New York Fed is pumping $60 billion again into the market every month through not QE. They're keeping the repo market going with hundreds of billions in overnight and term repos. Even Billy, my dog, who's not here today, would probably be able to make good money if he was that connected. So have I got proof that JP Morgan deals for the U.S. Treasury. Well, you don't need proof because that is known that it's JP Morgan is the banker for the U.S. Treasury. But if you want to see a visual confirmation, and unfortunately I can't show you these pictures because a lot of them are under license. But if you go onto Google and you type in Jon Snow, and that's not the Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, it's John, Jon Snow visits the London trading floors. And you type that into Google and go under images, and you see he was the U.S. Treasury Secretary for George Bush Jr. in the beginning. In 2003, he was at the helm. And I remember this really well because at the time I saw his photo when he visited London, and he was at the JP Morgan dealing room in London. And I thought to myself, why would Jon Snow visit the dealing room at JP Morgan London? And then I put two and two together and saw, realized that he's the guy in charge of the ESF. JP Morgan deals for the ESF. And how would JP Morgan benefit from that? Well, I'm not saying they front run the orders from the ESF, but they must have the Treasury has a direct line to all the JP Morgan dealing rooms. And I can tell you, having worked in the dealing room, people can see those lines flashing. And if you got ESF flashing on the boards, even before the dealer that deals for them picks it up, and let's say the Dow is down 400 points early in London, people will see that and they'll start buying the S&P or the Dow futures because they know the ESF is coming in to intervene, or in treasuries as well, or in gold. So being so close to such a huge fund really helps JP Morgan, and that's why JP Morgan is such a big power, I would say, in the futures market. I remember when I worked in the futures market, the way it works, you might work for ABN AMRO like I did, or even Citi Futures, which is part of Citibank, which I work for, or MF Global, who I work for. You might have a client that executes trades with you. He might also have an account with you, but he might also have an account with someone else. And I have to say, JP Morgan, loads of institutions had accounts with JP Morgan. How do I know that? Well, because a lot of times they traded through us and gave up the trades to be cleared at JP Morgan. They held their accounts at JP Morgan. That's how it works. We got the commission for executing the trade, and JP Morgan, of course, would clear the trade and get commission for clearing the trade and keeping the client's funds and margin accounts. That's how it worked. So it gives JP Morgan huge advantage. Also the fact that JP Morgan and Citigroup own the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, or part of it. There are other banks that own it as well. Don't forget, the regional reserve banks are private corporations. When you own a private corporation that can just create credit on the back of the American taxpayer, you can understand how it's very difficult for them not to do well. Can you imagine if we had that power? So that's all I'm saying. Yes, they were good results, but as I said earlier, even my dog Billy, who's not here today, could do well from that. And that's how they're related. So it all goes back to the gold confiscation and FDR's Executive Order 6102. It goes back to the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 and the profit that resulted from the confiscation because of that act. And it goes also to the Federal Reserve, which is a hybrid where the Federal Reserve Board might be public, but the Federal Reserve banks are private. So no wonder these banks do well. Yes, they're talking about the fact that the economy did well, but they also talk about how their investment banking operations did well. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Please share it far and wide. It helps the channel. Make sure you also hit the little notification bell above if you want to be notified of all my new videos. And you can also follow me on Twitter, BitChute, Steemit, and DTube. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.